Okay, so this is part 3 of these makeup videos for module 2. So let's talk a little bit about sleep disorders, right? First up is insomnia. You know, insomnia is something a lot of people experience, and it's repeated, right, inability to get enough sleep. And something like 12 to 20% of adults have insomnia at any given moment, more women than men, but obviously men can get insomnia too. More common in older people than younger people, though of course younger people can have insomnia too. And it's associated with some poor sleep habits. So you can check page 109 of your textbook for like a list of behaviors that can contribute to insomnia. It's things like exercising at night, right? So one of the cues that makes us feel sleepy and ready for bed is that our internal temperature drops. And if you're exercising at night, then you're making your internal temperature go up. And it actually can sort of fight with, your need to go to bed. Another one, of course, is things like caffeine. So check those lists if you're having trouble sleeping. And one cause of insomnia, of course, is worrying about not getting enough sleep, rather ironically, right? You can be lying there thinking, oh my God, I've only got 3 hours left. And that kind of creates a panic where you can't relax. Sleeping pills are a solution a lot of people turn to, but they can cause long-term problems. So they're not a long-term solution. You can get hooked on them. And once you stop taking them, there's insomnia that comes back, and it's often worse than before. It's called rebound insomnia. Now, CBT refers to cognitive behavioral therapy. It can be helpful. Things like how you reframe what's going on and your behaviors around lying there, not sleeping. Like, for example, they say it's a good idea to get up and do something for half an hour and then go back to bed, sort of have a reset. Well, I forgot my timer again. Let me get that timer going. Okay. So there's insomnia, and then there's sleep apnea. This is another pretty common problem caused by the throat closing during sleep. And so the person might wake up briefly, sometimes hundreds of times through the night, so that they can take a breath, and then they sort of dive back down into sleep. They might not remember those hundreds of awakenings. They're called micro awakenings, but they certainly interfere with having a good night's sleep. More common in middle-aged men, although of course it can happen to women, it can happen to people younger. It is associated for some people with obesity, where there's like a lot of weight on the neck, and it sort of contributes to collapsing the windpipe. Daytime tiredness, cardiovascular issues. The person might not be aware of their condition. Usually it's a sleeping partner who alerts them to it, because the apneic person snores a lot and has these moments of like choking and gasping for breath. So CPAP machine is a really useful strategy here. It's where there's a forced oxygen intake with that mask, which keeps everything open, right? Then there's narcolepsy. This one's pretty rare, and it's genetic. So you have to inherit the genes for narcolepsy to have this disorder. It's where the person has these periods of extreme sleepiness through the day during normal waking hours. And often they will actually like pass out, and they're in REM sleep when that happens. They've got the muscle paralysis, the whole deal. This can be treated for most people with stimulant medications. And that's a good thing, because otherwise, the person often has these bouts of sleep when they are surprised or aroused emotionally. Okay? So it can really interfere with life. REM behavior disorder. People with this disorder act out their dreams while sleeping, right? So they don't have the paralysis during REM that they're supposed to have. And so it can be really dangerous. They get up and act out their dreams. They've been known, there have been cases where someone is punching out their sleep partner because they're dreaming about, being in a battle. People have jumped out of windows. There's no treatment for this at this time. There are things like, you can tie the person to the bed so that they don't jump out the window and stuff like that. But it's caused by a neurological problem, seen most often in elderly guys, but women can get this too. And it's sometimes a sign that more sort of stuff is coming, things like dementia. Then there's sleepwalking. Fancy name for that is somnambulism, very common among young kids. And it's happening during slow wave sleep. So they're not getting up and acting out their dreams. They're in deep sleep, usually within an hour or two of falling asleep. This is where the person sleepwalks. They often have their eyes open, and you can even sort of talk to them and they might respond, although it might not make a lot of sense. Contrary to the sort of myth that if you wake up a sleepwalker, they're going to be violent, you can wake them up. It's just hard to do because they're in deep sleep. So an easier thing to do, is to guide them back to bed, and they can go willingly back to bed. Although you might have to kind of sleepwalk proof your house. If some sleepwalkers have been known to open doors, things like that, right? Okay, let's turn now to meditation as another example of an altered state. So this is a practice where intense contemplation leads to a degree of mental calmness that can be considered an altered state. So there's a couple types of meditation we're going to mention. First up is mindfulness meditation. This is where you let your thoughts flow freely. You pay attention to them as they come and go, but you don't get stuck to them. You don't react to them. You just kind of watch, the stuff flowing by in your mental kind of theater. And then there's concentrative meditation, which is where you focus your attention on something like your breathing pattern or an image or a mantra, which is a sort of word or set of words that you repeat over and over and over again. Like transcendental meditation is a popular Western form of concentrative meditation. And with TM, you are given a mantra that is unique to you and that you keep sort of secret. And that's used during the meditation. Research into meditation has found that it can lead to greater stress reduction and memory improvements compared to a control group that did just relaxation exercises. So the research into meditation is really interesting, and it looks like it's really good for us, right? Some research suggests that it can alter the brain in a way that maintains brain functioning over the lifespan. For example, though brain volume normally decreases as we get older, one study found that it did not diminish in older adults who had been practicing meditation. So it's good for your brain. And then, of course, when we talk about altered states, we need to talk about the drugs that can alter our consciousness. So throughout history, across all cultures, people have discovered that some substances can alter our mental states, right? And they are often incorporated into religious rituals or lifestyle kind of behaviors. So drugs can create a temporary pleasant state, but there is potential for negative consequences, especially in the long term with some drugs. So we're talking about addiction, injury, even possibly death, depending on what drugs we're talking about. So let's take a look at some categories of drugs. So psychoactive drugs refer to drugs that are mind-altering substances. They are changing the brain's neurochemistry by activating neurotransmitter systems. And there's like four main classes of drugs that create altered states of consciousness. There's stimulants, depressants, opioids, and hallucinogens. And some of these have legitimate therapeutic use, but they can also be abused outside of treatment. And, there's no free lunch in life, so there are often side effects to these drugs. So let's start with stimulants. A stimulant is a drug that will activate the sympathetic nervous system, right? So that's heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tension. They can improve mood. They can make people restless. They can disrupt sleep. So, everything from caffeine through to amphetamines, nicotine, cocaine. These are all stimulants. And they're going to work by letting dopamine remain in the synapses for longer, which prolongs its impact. Some stimulants can also increase the amount of dopamine that neurons are producing. Remember that dopamine is the neurotransmitter behind rewards and craving, right? So anytime we want something, enjoy something, feel pleasure, dopamine is part of that. It's interesting historical stuff here. Cocaine was legal in the US for a long time. Like Coca-Cola was so named because there was cocaine in it, right? It was outlawed in 1906. So it creates a wave of confidence, well-being, energy, sociability, alertness, and it works by increasing the concentration of dopamine in the synapses. Now, using cocaine a lot in large doses can lead to things like paranoia, where you think people are out to get you, psychotic behavior, which means like being disconnected from reality, and even violent behavior. Then there's methamphetamines. About 4% of the US population has tried meth, so it's not a typical drug for most recreational drug users. It's pretty easy to make using over-the-counter drugs and simple laboratory methods. So this is why you have to show your ID when you buy, cough syrup at the drugstore. So meth works by blocking the reuptake of dopamine. So there's more dopamine in the synapse and increasing the amount of dopamine that gets released. It stays in the body longer than cocaine does, so it has longer term effects. And over time, meth can damage a lot of parts of our bodies, right? Brain structures, including the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, limbic system, and the rest of the body, right? So there are all these amazing images here, like before and after, of people who, have meth habits. It's really hard on your body. All right, what about depressants? Depressants reduce behavioral and mental activity by slowing down the central nervous system. And in large doses, they can kind of induce sleep, which is why they're sometimes also called sedatives. Like anti-anxiety drugs are depressants. Alcohol is a depressant too. And they produce their effects by ramping up GABA, right? They activate the GABA receptors. Remember that GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? It's calming everything down. And for alcohol, in addition to affecting GABA, it also activates the dopamine receptors, and it interferes with the neurochemical processes behind memory, which is why some people who get drunk frequently have like blocks of time where they don't remember anything. It's called a blackout, right? Some interesting gender differences here. Across cultures, men drink a lot more alcohol than women do. Are there exceptions to this? Of course. But when you look at big samples, men drink more and more often. Men are twice as likely to report binge drinking, heavy drinking, and being drunk recently than women. And in a lot of cultures, people see alcohol as a kind of magic elixir that can increase your social skills, sexual pleasure, confidence, power, decrease your anxiety. But the research shows, in fact, drinking after a hard day can increase the focus on negatives. While moderate doses can be related to more positive moods, higher doses are related to more negative moods, right? So when someone gets significantly drunk, they might be dwelling in their problems and issues and becoming kind of more upset. Then there's opioids. This is a family of drugs that are natural or synthetic forms of opium. So we're talking about heroin here, morphine, codeine, fentanyl, Vicodin. All of these are pain relievers. They also can produce relaxation and euphoria in people who take them. So heroin provides this intense rush, followed by a relaxed kind of stupor where the person is just sort of lying around. Heroin is highly addictive, so is morphine, probably because they increase the pleasure by binding to opiate receptors, and they increase the wanting of the drug by activating dopamine receptors, right? So in the past, heroin was marketed as a legal pain reliever. Aspirin originally contained heroin before it was outlawed. Now, chronic use of opioids is likely to lead to abuse or addiction, more likely than, say, short-term use. So, if you break your arm, the doctor might give you, some morphine pills, or even some fentanyl, right? And it's a great pain reliever, but you're not going to be allowed to be on that for a long time because chronic use means long-term use, predicts things like, addiction. So they're not a great solution for chronic pain, right? Chronic means long-term. Long-term use of opioids is associated with attention problems, memory problems. And so the current kind of epidemic that we are living through is due mainly to opioids like fentanyl, OxyContin, and Vicodin that have been prescribed to people for chronic pain, right? 75% of the drug-related deaths in the US are due to opioids, and a lot of those are prescribed medications. A lot of first responders carry naloxone or Narcan, which is an opioid antagonist. Remember, we talked about that in an earlier lecture. This can reverse the effect of an opioid and help people survive an overdose. And now, MCC has Narcan stations. I underwent a little training session where I was taught how to administer Narcan. Right? So it's part of the world in our lives now in a way that it didn't used to be because of all of these prescribed drugs that are super powerful and highly addictive. Check my timer. Oh, we're going to finish this up. So hallucinogens, these drugs alter both sensation and perception. So we start with the granddaddy of them all, which is LSD, discovered in 1938. It is derived from a chemical in a fungus called ergot. And an LSD trip, an LSD experience can last a long time, something like 12 hours. And it can produce extreme hallucinations, which can be pleasant or unpleasant. And when they're unpleasant, we would call that a bad trip, right? It also creates time distortions where, the person might feel like hours have gone by, but it's only been minutes. Or conversely, they feel like only minutes have gone by, but it's been hours. So there's research underway now exploring the usefulness of LSD in treating depression, like microdosing. Lots of cool research showing this might be helpful for people, and other chronic mental illnesses too. So there's LSD, then there's peyote, right? This comes from the peyote cactus. And then there's mushrooms like psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. These also create hallucinogenic experiences. And they've been used for centuries in religious rituals around the world where they grow. And yeah, there's research underway now looking at potential therapeutic use of these as well. We're sort of experiencing a renaissance in research interest into hallucinogens. Then there's MDMA. This is ecstasy or Molly. This creates an energizing effect like a stimulant, but it also can induce mild hallucinations, things like seeing tracers when you move your hand in front of you. It became popular in the 90s as a party drug, right? So yeah, ecstasy. Long-term use here can cause impairment in memory, problems performing complicated tasks. So again, there is no free lunch in life. Heavy use of any of these drugs may well impact how you function. Now, MDMA may also have therapeutic effects. For example, they're looking at whether it can help people with post-traumatic stress because it promotes feelings of compassion and trust. It reduces negative emotions that people have about their trauma, even when the drug wears off. So that's kind of exciting. Then there's cannabis. The dried leaves and flower buds of one type of cannabis plant are used in making joints, for example. It's the most widely used illicit drug in the world, marijuana. And marijuana is an interesting beast. It can be categorized as a stimulant because it stimulates appetite. It can be categorized as a depressant because it mellows people out and makes them feel sleepy. Or it can even be characterized as a hallucinogen because it can create perceptual and cognitive distortions, especially in high doses. It also has medicinal properties, right? It can help people overcome nausea associated with chemotherapy. It can help with pain. It can help with glaucoma. And as of 2020, most states allow medicinal use of marijuana, and many have legalized recreational use, right? So we're kind of living through an interesting time here where something that had been considered illegal and dangerous is now coming out of the shadows. All right, a little bit about substance use disorder. So the recreational use of drugs can sometimes have negative consequences, including getting addicted, right? And maybe even dying. More Americans are now killed by drug overdoses than traffic accidents. And this is the opioid crisis we're talking about here. So a disorder in which people feel an irresistible urge to use a drug despite negative consequences, that's substance use disorder, right? So it's ruining their life, and yet they're still irresistibly drawn to using the drug. there are physical and psychological factors here. So we can talk about physical dependence. This is when the user develops a tolerance to the drug. So the body gets used to the drug being in the system. And so what that means is you're going to need to sort of up your dose in order to have the exhilarating or pleasant effects of the drug over time, right? And it's going to mean that the person will suffer withdrawal when they don't ingest the drug because the body has gotten used to it being there. So withdrawal is characterized by anxiety, tension, craving for the drug, and a host of physical symptoms that are going to vary as a function of which kind of drug we're talking about. But it's often, symptoms that are, akin to a really bad flu. So nausea, chills, fever, body sweats, tremors. Yeah. And a person can be psychologically dependent without being physically dependent, right? So they have this craving for the drug that can happen in the absence of physical addiction. So how do people develop substance use disorder? A big piece of this is dopamine. Dopamine is all about pleasure and craving, right? So it underlies the rewarding properties of taking drugs. This is why the drugs feel good, because they are ramping up dopamine. You could also inherit a cluster of characteristics that favor risk-taking and impulsive behavior, and a reduced concern for personal harm, and a predisposition to find chemical substances pleasurable, right? So genes will play a part as well in determining whether somebody is going to benignly, recreationally use or end up with a problem. So who's likely to develop substance use disorder? Something like 8 to 10% of people who use the drugs become addicted to them, which means, 92% of people who use drugs do not become addicted to them. So that's interesting, right? We're trying to kind of identify markers that would predict, hey, you should never use because you might end up with a problem. Excuse me. So yeah, most of the 90 million Americans who've experimented with recreational drugs use them occasionally, or maybe use them for a while and then stop. Like, maybe they're using them as young adults and then they kind of stop doing it. And some research even shows that adults who had experimented with drugs when they were teenagers are better adjusted than either people who'd never tried them or people who ended up as heavy users. So yeah, genes are going to play a role here in making some people more responsive to the reinforcing properties of drugs and therefore more likely to become addicted. But there isn't evidence for a single addiction gene. An inherited predisposition to seeking out strong sensations may predict behaviors like associating with drug users and abusing drugs, right? We can't predict who will develop a substance use disorder yet, but we can identify some teenagers, for example, who are likely to experiment with drugs and abuse alcohol. There's a lot of research looking at that because this is, something that adults worry a lot about. They worry about their teenage kids doing naughty things and getting in trouble, right? So teens who are attracted to novelty, which means like new things, new experiences, teens who are like into risk-taking and sort of enjoy the thrill of that, and teens who have poor relationships with their parents. These are the folks who are more likely to smoke cigarettes, use drugs, drink alcohol, and associate with other kids who do the same. Okay. What about family or social environment and drug use? So social learning theorists focus on the roles of parents, the mass media, the peer group, including self-identification with high-risk groups, right? So like teenagers who are hanging out with the stoners or the druggies, all these different categories, these different cliques in high school, right? They're going to be at higher risk for using as well. And let's not forget, kids will watch their parents' behavior and learn from it too. So, how the parents use alcohol, when they drink, how much they drink, consequences of drinking. Kids are watching all that and kind of developing a sense of norms around how to use alcohol. Okay, we've reached the end here, so I'm going to put an end to this video. Bye for now.